Imagine being able to understand what someone is really thinking, not from what they say, but from what they don't say. Imagine recognizing their deepest fears, hidden desires, and unconscious motivations just by observing their behavior, their word choices, their seemingly innocent slips of the tongue. This isn't science fiction or supernatural ability. This is exactly what Sigmund Freud developed over decades of studying the human psyche. And while most people think Freud's ideas are outdated or irrelevant, the truth is that his techniques for reading the unconscious mind are more powerful and applicable today than ever before. Freud discovered that the human mind is constantly revealing its secrets through what he called the royal road to the unconscious. But most people don't know how to read the signs, how to interpret the clues, how to decode the hidden messages that everyone is unconsciously broadcasting. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to teach you Freud's most powerful techniques for reading people's minds, not through mystical intuition, but through scientific observation of unconscious patterns that reveal more about someone's inner world than they would ever consciously admit. You'll learn how to recognize what Freud called the return of the repressed, how people's deepest secrets leak out through their jokes, their mistakes, their dreams, and their seemingly random behaviors. You'll discover how to identify someone's core psychological conflicts, their hidden motivations, and their unconscious fears just by paying attention to patterns they don't even realize they're creating. This isn't about manipulation or exploitation. This is about understanding. When you can read the unconscious mind, you can understand why people behave the way they do, why they make the choices they make, and what they really need, even when they don't know it themselves. If you've ever wanted to understand the hidden psychology behind human behavior, if you've been frustrated by people who say one thing but do another, or if you want to develop the ability to see through facades and understand what's really driving someone's actions, this video will give you the tools Freud used to revolutionize our understanding of the human mind. Because everyone is constantly telling you their deepest secrets, you just need to know how to listen. Freud's first breakthrough in reading minds came from his discovery that the unconscious mind has its own language, a language that speaks through symbols, patterns, and what he called parapraxes, or Freudian slips. Most people think Freudian slips are just random mistakes, but Freud understood that there are no accidents in human behavior. Every slip of the tongue, every forgotten name, every random mistake is actually the unconscious mind trying to communicate something that the conscious mind is trying to hide. Freud wrote, "The unconscious is the true psychical reality. In its innermost nature, it is as much unknown to us as the reality of the external world." But while the unconscious remains hidden, it constantly leaves traces, breadcrumbs that reveal its contents to anyone who knows how to read them. Here's how to start reading these unconscious signals. First, pay attention to what Freud called symptomatic acts, seemingly meaningless behaviors that actually reveal unconscious conflicts or desires. When someone constantly checks their phone during conversations, they're not just being rude. They're unconsciously communicating that they feel trapped or anxious in social situations. When someone always arrives late to certain types of events, they're not just disorganized. They're unconsciously expressing resistance or ambivalence about those situations. Freud discovered that these patterns are never random. The person who's always late to family gatherings but punctual for work is unconsciously communicating something about their relationship with family obligation versus professional identity. Second, listen for what Freud called Verbal slips. Moments when someone says something other than what they consciously intended. But here's the key. Don't just notice the obvious slips. Pay attention to word choices, repeated phrases, and linguistic patterns that reveal unconscious preoccupations. Someone who constantly uses war metaphors when talking about their job, fighting deadlines, battling competitors, surviving meetings, is unconsciously revealing that they experience work as a hostile environment, even if they consciously claim to love their career. Someone who frequently uses passive voice when describing their life. Things just happened to me. It turned out badly. Mistakes were made, is unconsciously communicating that they feel powerless and avoid taking responsibility for their choices. Third, observe what Freud called repetition compulsions, unconscious patterns where people repeatedly create the same types of situations, relationships, or conflicts. The person who always ends up in relationships with emotionally unavailable partners isn't just unlucky. They're unconsciously recreating familiar dynamics from their past. The individual who consistently gets into conflicts with authority figures isn't just rebellious. They're unconsciously working through unresolved issues with parental authority. Freud understood that these repetitions aren't conscious choices. They're the unconscious mind's attempt to master unresolved psychological conflicts by recreating them in new contexts. Fourth, pay attention to what Freud called reaction formations, behaviors that are the exact opposite of someone's unconscious desires or impulses. The person who is excessively neat and organized may be unconsciously defending against chaotic or destructive impulses. The individual who is overly generous and self-sacrificing may be unconsciously compensating for selfish or aggressive feelings they can't accept in themselves. Freud discovered that when someone's behavior seems extreme or forced, it's often covering up its opposite in the unconscious mind. Fifth, notice what Freud called projection, the unconscious tendency to attribute one's own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or motivations to others. The person who constantly accuses others of being dishonest is often struggling with their own integrity issues. The individual who sees manipulation everywhere is often unconsciously aware of their own manipulative tendencies. Freud wrote, "It is a predisposition of paranoid delusions that the patient can perceive the unconscious of others with particular sharpness and react to it. When someone consistently sees the same negative traits in multiple people, they're often projecting their own unconscious shadow onto others." Freud's most famous discovery was that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, a direct window into someone's deepest fears, desires, and conflicts. But you don't need to be a psychoanalyst to use dream analysis to understand people's inner worlds. Freud identified specific patterns in dreams that reveal universal psychological themes, and these same patterns appear in people's fantasies, daydreams, and even their entertainment preferences. Here's how to read the unconscious through dreams and fantasy material. First, understand what Freud called dream symbolism, the unconscious mind's tendency to represent psychological conflicts through symbolic imagery. When someone frequently dreams about being chased, they're not just having nightmares. They're unconsciously processing feelings of being pursued by something they're trying to avoid in their waking life. This could be responsibility, intimacy, success, or any other psychological challenge they're not ready to face. When someone dreams about flying, they're often unconsciously expressing desires for freedom, escape, or transcendence of current limitations. When they dream about falling, They're typically processing fears about losing control or failing to meet expectations. But Freud's genius was recognizing that dream symbols are highly personal. The same symbol can mean different things for different people, based on their individual psychological history and conflicts. Second, pay attention to what Freud called day residues, how recent events get incorporated into dreams and reveal unconscious preoccupations. If someone mentions a dream that includes elements from a recent conversation, pay attention to how those elements are transformed in the dream. The unconscious mind doesn't just replay events. It reshapes them to express hidden psychological material. Someone who dreams about a work meeting, but in the dream they're naked, is unconsciously processing feelings of vulnerability or exposure in their professional life. Someone who dreams about a family dinner, but in the dream the food is poisoned, is unconsciously expressing anxiety or hostility about family relationships. Third, listen for what Freud called manifest versus latent content. The difference between what someone says their dream was about and what it actually reveals about their unconscious mind. The manifest content is the surface story of the dream. The latent content is the unconscious psychological material that the dream is actually expressing. Someone might describe a dream about losing their keys as just a random anxiety dream. But Freud would recognize this as potentially representing fears about losing access to something important, their identity, their security, their sense of control, or their connection to others. Fourth, observe patterns in someone's entertainment preferences, fantasies, and daydreams using Freudian analysis. The movies someone chooses, the books they read, the TV shows they binge watch, all reveal unconscious psychological material. Freud understood that we're drawn to stories that resonate with our own unconscious conflicts and desires. Someone who's obsessed with revenge fantasies in their entertainment is often unconsciously processing feelings of powerlessness or injustice in their own life. Someone who's drawn to romantic comedies where the protagonist has to choose between two lovers is often unconsciously working through their own conflicts about commitment and freedom. Fifth, pay attention to what Freud called screen memories, seemingly innocent childhood memories that actually represent more significant psychological material. When someone frequently mentions specific childhood memories, especially ones that seem emotionally charged or that they return to repeatedly, these memories are often screens for more complex psychological themes. Someone who often talks about a childhood memory of being lost in a store is often unconsciously processing deeper themes about abandonment, safety, or their relationship with parental protection. Someone who frequently mentions a memory about winning a school competition is often unconsciously working through themes about achievement, recognition, or sibling rivalry. Freud discovered that these screen memories condense multiple psychological themes into single, seemingly simple narratives that the conscious mind can tolerate. The key to reading someone's unconscious through their dreams and fantasies is recognizing that the unconscious mind speaks in metaphors, symbols, and emotional themes rather than literal content. When someone tells you about a dream, don't just listen to what happened. Listen for the emotional themes, the power dynamics, the fears and desires that are being expressed through the symbolic content. Freud's most practical insight for reading minds was his discovery of psychological defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies people use to protect themselves from anxiety, pain, or unacceptable thoughts and feelings. But here's what most people don't understand. Defense mechanisms don't just hide psychological material. They reveal it. The way someone defends against their unconscious mind actually tells you exactly what they're defending against. Freud wrote, "The ego's defenses against unpleasure can themselves become sources of unpleasure." When you learn to recognize defense mechanisms, you can read someone's deepest psychological conflicts by observing how they protect themselves from those conflicts. Here are the most revealing defense mechanisms and how to read them. First, denial. The refusal to acknowledge obvious reality. When someone consistently denies clear facts about their situation, they're revealing what they find most threatening to acknowledge. The person who denies that their drinking is a problem is revealing that they're terrified of losing control or facing their dependency. The individual who denies that their relationship is troubled is revealing that they can't tolerate the possibility of abandonment or failure. Freud understood that what someone denies most vehemently is often what they know most deeply to be true. Second, projection. Attributing one's own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to others. This defense mechanism is particularly revealing because it shows you exactly what someone is struggling with internally. The person who constantly accuses others of being selfish is often defending against their own selfish impulses. The individual who sees dishonesty everywhere is often struggling with their own integrity issues. But Freud discovered something even more sophisticated. People often project their unconscious desires as well as their fears. The person who's always suspicious of others' motives may be unconsciously aware of their own manipulative tendencies. Third, rationalization. Creating logical explanations for behavior that's actually driven by unconscious motivations. When someone's explanations for their behavior seem overly complex or don't quite add up, they're often rationalizing unconscious impulses. The person who gives elaborate explanations for why they can't commit to relationships is often rationalizing their fear of intimacy. The individual who has complex theories about why they can't succeed professionally is often rationalizing their fear of failure or success. Freud recognized that the more sophisticated someone's rationalization, the more threatening the underlying truth must be. Fourth, reaction formation. Adopting behaviors that are the opposite of one's unconscious impulses. This defense is particularly revealing because it shows you what someone is most afraid of in themselves. The person who is excessively moral or righteous is often defending against impulses they consider immoral or wrong. The individual who is overly helpful and self-sacrificing is often defending against selfish or aggressive feelings. Freud discovered that reaction formations are usually extreme and rigid. They lack the flexibility of genuine personality traits because they're constantly working against unconscious pressure. Fifth, displacement. Redirecting emotions from their original target to a safer one. This defense reveals both what someone is really feeling and what they're afraid to confront directly. The person who comes home from work and yells at their family is often displacing anger they can't express toward their boss. The individual who becomes obsessed with political issues may be displacing personal powerlessness onto societal problems. Freud understood that displaced emotions are often more intense than the situation warrants because they're carrying the weight of the original unexpressed feeling. Sixth, sublimation. Channeling unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities. This defense can reveal someone's unconscious drives through their chosen outlets. The person who becomes obsessed with competitive sports may be sublimating aggressive impulses. The individual who throws themselves into charitable work may be sublimating guilt or a need for moral superiority. Freud considered sublimation the healthiest defense mechanism but it still reveals the underlying psychological material being transformed. The key to reading defense mechanisms is recognizing that they're not random. They're specifically designed to protect against particular psychological threats. When you identify someone's primary defenses, you can infer what they're most afraid of facing about themselves. But Freud also discovered something crucial. Defense mechanisms often fail, and when they do, the underlying psychological material breaks through in what he called the return of the repressed. Pay attention to moments when someone's usual defenses break down, when they're stressed, tired, drunk, or emotionally overwhelmed. These are the moments when their unconscious mind is most likely to reveal itself directly. Freud's most powerful tool for reading minds was his discovery of transference, the unconscious tendency to recreate past relationships in present interactions. This phenomenon reveals more about someone's psychological history and core conflicts than almost any other observable behavior. Freud wrote, "The patient sees in his analyst the return, the reincarnation, of some important figure out of his childhood or past, and consequently transfers on to him feelings and reactions that undoubtedly applied to this model." But transference doesn't just happen in therapy. It happens in every significant relationship. When you learn to recognize transference patterns, you can read someone's deepest psychological wounds, their earliest relationship dynamics, and their unconscious expectations about how relationships work. Here's how to identify and read transference patterns. First, pay attention to repetitive relationship patterns. When someone consistently creates the same types of dynamics across different relationships. The person who always ends up feeling abandoned in relationships is often unconsciously recreating early experiences of abandonment, usually with parental figures. They're not just unlucky in love. They're unconsciously drawn to people who will recreate familiar patterns of loss and rejection. The individual who consistently finds themselves in relationships where they feel controlled or suffocated is often transferring early experiences with overly controlling or intrusive caregivers onto their current partners. Freud understood that these patterns aren't conscious choices. They're unconscious attempts to master unresolved psychological conflicts by recreating them in new contexts. Second, observe emotional intensity that doesn't match the situation. When someone's reaction to a current event seems disproportionate to what's actually happening. When someone becomes extremely angry about a minor slight, they're often transferring feelings from past experiences of being hurt, dismissed, or betrayed. The current situation is triggering unconscious memories and emotions from earlier relationships. When someone becomes unusually anxious about a partner being late or unavailable, they're often transferring early fears about abandonment or unreliability from childhood caregivers. Freud discovered that the intensity of someone's emotional reaction often reveals how much unconscious material is being activated by the current situation. Third, notice projection of parental dynamics. When someone unconsciously casts others in parental roles and responds to them as if they were childhood authority figures. The person who becomes rebellious and defiant with bosses or authority figures is often transferring unresolved conflicts with parental authority. They're not just responding to their current boss. They're unconsciously fighting battles with their parents. The individual who becomes excessively compliant and people-pleasing in relationships is often transferring early patterns of trying to earn love and approval from caregivers who were conditional in their affection. Fourth, pay attention to idealization, and devaluation cycles. When someone alternates between seeing others as perfect and seeing them as terrible. This pattern often reveals what Freud called splitting, the unconscious tendency to divide people into all good and all bad categories, because integrating both positive and negative qualities feels too threatening. Someone who idealizes new romantic partners and then becomes completely disillusioned with them is often transferring early experiences with caregivers who were inconsistent, disappointing, or emotionally unavailable. Fifth, observe rescue fantasies and victim dynamics. When someone consistently positions themselves as either the rescuer or the victim in relationships, the person who's always trying to save others is often unconsciously attempting to rescue their own wounded inner child by saving others who remind them of their own past helplessness. The individual who consistently finds themselves in victim positions is often unconsciously recreating early experiences of powerlessness, hoping that this time someone will rescue them in the way they needed to be rescued as a child. Freud understood that these dynamics reveal both someone's deepest wounds and their unconscious strategies for trying to heal those wounds. Sixth, notice boundary patterns. How someone manages closeness and distance in relationships. The person who becomes anxious when relationships get too close is often transferring early experiences of engulfment, intrusion, or loss of autonomy. They're unconsciously protecting themselves from repeating past experiences of being overwhelmed or controlled. The individual who becomes desperate when relationships involve any distance is often transferring early experiences of abandonment or emotional neglect. They're unconsciously trying to prevent the repetition of past losses. The most sophisticated aspect of reading transference is recognizing that people often unconsciously choose partners and friends who will play complementary roles in recreating their early relationship dynamics. The person with abandonment issues often unconsciously chooses partners who are emotionally unavailable. The individual with control issues often unconsciously chooses partners who are either very controlling or very passive. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate familiar patterns, even when those patterns are painful, because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. When you can recognize someone's transference patterns, you can understand not just their current behavior, but the entire psychological template they're unconsciously using to navigate relationships. Now that you understand Freud's individual techniques for reading the unconscious mind, the real power comes from integrating these approaches into a comprehensive system for understanding human psychology. Freud's genius wasn't just in identifying these phenomena. It was in recognizing how they work together to create a complete picture of someone's unconscious mental life. Here's how to combine Freudian techniques into a practical system for reading minds. First, start with pattern recognition across multiple domains. Don't just look for unconscious material in one area. Look for consistent themes that appear across someone's dreams, their relationships, their defense mechanisms, and their behavioral patterns. If someone frequently dreams about being trapped, consistently chooses relationships where they feel controlled, uses rationalization to explain why they can't make changes in their life, and has a history of rebelling against authority figures, you're seeing a coherent unconscious theme around autonomy and control. The power of Freudian analysis comes from recognizing how the same unconscious conflicts express themselves through multiple channels simultaneously. Second, practice developmental reconstruction, using current patterns to infer someone's early psychological experiences. Freud understood that adult psychology is largely determined by childhood experiences, but those experiences leave specific fingerprints in adult behavior. Someone who has difficulty trusting others becomes anxious when people are late or unavailable, and has dreams about being abandoned, likely experienced early disruptions in their primary attachment relationships. Someone who becomes aggressive when they feel criticized, has fantasies about being superior to others, and uses projection to see hostility in others, likely experienced early experiences of shame, criticism, or emotional attack. Third, develop unconscious listening, the ability to hear what someone is really communicating beneath their conscious words. When someone says, "I don't care what people think," they're often unconsciously communicating that they care very much what people think and are defending against that vulnerability. When someone says, "I'm fine with being alone," they're often unconsciously communicating anxiety about abandonment or rejection. Freud taught that the unconscious often communicates through negation. People unconsciously reveal their true feelings by denying them. Fourth, learn to recognize psychological contradictions. Moments when someone's behavior, emotions, or statements don't align with each other. These contradictions often reveal unconscious conflicts between different parts of the psyche. Someone might consciously want success, but unconsciously sabotage their achievements because success triggers unconscious guilt or fear. Someone might consciously claim to want intimacy, but unconsciously choose partners who are emotionally unavailable because intimacy triggers unconscious fears of engulfment or abandonment. Fifth, practice empathic inference, using your own emotional reactions to understand someone's unconscious material. Freud discovered that unconscious material is often communicated through what he called projective identification, the unconscious process by which someone makes others feel what they're feeling. If you consistently feel anxious around someone who seems calm, they may be unconsciously projecting their anxiety onto you. If you feel angry or frustrated with someone who appears helpless, they may be unconsciously communicating their own suppressed anger through their helplessness. Your emotional reactions to others often contain valuable information about their unconscious mental state. Sixth, develop therapeutic neutrality, the ability to observe and understand without judgment or the need to fix or change. Freud understood that the moment you become emotionally invested in changing someone's unconscious patterns, you lose your ability to read them clearly. Your own needs and reactions start to interfere with your perception. The most powerful mind readers maintain what Freud called evenly suspended attention, a state of open, non-judgmental awareness that allows unconscious material to emerge naturally. Finally, remember that Freudian mind reading isn't about gaining power over others. It's about developing deeper understanding and empathy. When you can see someone's unconscious conflicts, their psychological defenses, and their deepest fears and desires, you develop what Freud called analytic compassion, the ability to understand why people behave the way they do, even when their behavior seems irrational or destructive. This understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it provides context that can inform more effective and compassionate responses. Freud's techniques for reading minds are ultimately tools for understanding the human condition, the universal struggles, conflicts, and desires that drive all human behavior. When you master these techniques, you don't just become better at reading others, you become better at understanding yourself, because the same unconscious processes that operate in others are operating in you. The unconscious mind is constantly communicating, constantly revealing its secrets through dreams, slips, patterns, and relationships. Most people go through life unconscious of these communications, missing the rich psychological information that's available in every interaction. But now you have the tools Freud developed to decode these messages, to read the hidden psychology behind human behavior, and to understand the unconscious forces that shape every aspect of human experience.